Peaking and tapering. Why have I got a beautiful cup of latte there? Because really, peaking and tapering is all about letting that fitness come to the top, like nice coffee should do. You know, it's for a lot of you, you build a lot of time into your training, you do a lot of training over the winter. Unquestionably, you're fit. But what we need to do is to make sure that that fitness comes through by being fresh enough so your form's there. So it's really about letting the fitness rise to the top. Many of you will have heard me wax lyrical about this performance triad. You know, how training is only one aspect of the whole lifestyle of being an athlete. You know, you've got to think in equal measure about nutrition and your recovery. Training is just what you throw at the body to make it uncomfortable, so that when you come back to the next training session or race, you've built back stronger. That's the only reason we train. And we'll come back in a bit later about that whole concept of, well, you might not have made the 8 intervals that I set you in the session, but as long as you've done 5 to very good effect and you've got that stress, that's what's important. It's not about hitting 8 perfectly. And I think sometimes it's very, very easy to get caught up, isn't it, on the detail of the training session, and we can miss the point a little bit. It's not about going out when you're tired. You might think, actually today I need to recover from the session before so I can train well again tomorrow. So it's all about stress, relaxation, and we need the nutrition there to put those building blocks back into the body so that your body can build back stronger. So think about training in a way that it builds fitness, but it also fatigues you. So in other words, form, our good race performance, is all about managing fitness going up and this plus and minus of fatigue. The day after the session, you might have high fatigue. 2 days later, you'll have lower fatigue. Or weight training, you quite often see 2 days later more fatigue because your muscles are still sore. So you think the training you've done has presented fitness and fatigue. How rested you are will give you your form, will give you your race performance. So it's all about that equation. So don't think training gets you fit, because training also gets you tired. Everyone's really excited now because they're thinking, brilliant, Helen's going to give you 7 rest days. So this is the general physiology of that whole model. It's, you know, we apply a training session, and what happens is, momentarily, your fitness sort of goes down because you're so fatigued, it's overwhelmed, the training effect. But then if you rest, you get a period where your fitness or your form really comes to the surface. So the keys with your training plan is that we actually build this slight negative cycle, let you recover, throw another stimulus in, recover, another stimulus in, and we get this gradual build in training load. If you don't rest enough, you can actually get a negative effect on your fitness and your form over time. There's nothing wrong with this. You might have seen some models of training where training sessions come in very, very quick succession, and you go on a downward slope, but then you have a very big rest recovery block, and you get this super compensation that's meant to be even bigger. So if you think about it, the way that I plan your training, it's all about predominantly 4-week blocks, where I train you harder over the first 3, and then you have a bit of an easier week in week 4. Unless you're Seb, and I just keep throwing more at you. I remember Seb once saying to me, you know, I can't believe I'm doing this in week 4 of my block. Yeah. And I didn't give him any rest before the next block either. Didn't make sense. You mug. I don't know. He's a sponge. Hamster, that was running there. Okay, so peaking. This is the ideal scenario, isn't it? It's that we plan your training in a way that when you want to be fit, you are, and you're really raring to go. The key components to a good peaking training plan, it's all about building in training stress and overloading you, progressing you. And we do that by manipulations in intensity, frequency and volume. But it's also about having adequate recovery, the pre-event taper. So you've got your ongoing training plan, you know when your goal events are, and we make sure that the taper comes in line with that. We ensure that by having that process of periodization, and that is why I nag you endlessly to please tell me when your races are, because I can't plan your training plan without knowing when your races are. Okay? Probably worth just at this point throwing in a couple of definitions of you, because peaking and tapering, sometimes people use them interchangeably and they are subtly different. Peaking is actually the process by which we try and bring both physiological and psychological readiness. It's all planned. You know, I look where your race events are in the future, and I try and map out the route from where you are now and what changes you need to make to get to where you want to be. It's really critical that we lay those goal events down. That also allows me to factor in the taper. So when you say to me, Helen, this race is important to me, I factor in a 10 or 14-day taper to make sure that we reduce the physiological and psychological stress that comes from training. So when we're planning a taper, what we need to do is think about reduction of the training load, whether that be through intensity, volume, frequency. And we'll come on in a moment to what the best thing to do in a taper week. Trying to manage the fatigue, but at the same time physiological adaptations, because there is that, well, if I'm training less, will I detrain? The type of taper. By mode, I mean there's different ways that you can reduce the training load very suddenly, or you can drop it off in a very gradual way. We'll talk about those in a minute. How long is your taper going to be? And like I said before, the key element in there is needing your performance goals. Where do you want to be and at what time? So, I've already said training has a positive and a negative effect. So what everyone needs to do is just to get their head around this, that sometimes taper is about giving up a little bit of your fitness by not training intensely for 10 to 14 days in exchange for performance. Yeah? Quite often we just take a little bit of your edge off. We don't keep building fitness in the taper. It's about getting you fresh. There's always that temptation, isn't there, to if you've been ill, to try and cram a little bit too much training into that final week before a race, trying to grab at it. Best thing you can do is actually rest up and let that freshness come through a little bit more. So you have to be able to let go. Because if you can let go, then there are some really good benefits to be had. This is a fairly recent paper by some person that I can't pronounce their name, Hani Malaki, paper from 2009. And what they did here was 25-mile time trial. And if you look, you've got two groups, a group that performed a taper and a control group, so a group that kept on training. And their first time trial, the groups are fairly similar. And they're obviously getting fitter, 4 weeks of training, 8 weeks of training. Then at 8 weeks, the group that were going to do a taper dropped their training load by 50%. And you can see here, they start to outperform the control group considerably. So we've gone from a 54.5 compared to a just over 53. So about 3 to 6% improvement across the group. So definitely worth having. But interestingly, a 7 and a 21-day taper, you can see there's not a lot of difference. So for events of about an hour long, it looks like that 7-day period tends to be enough. I'm not even going to try and go through this list now. Hopefully just the massive information there will just overwhelm you and say, yeah, it's definitely worth doing a taper. But there are increases in maximal oxygen uptake by about 6%. Efficiency is seen to improve significantly. Hiya, go ahead. Loads of changes in the blood, certainly things like blood cell volume come back, so we can carry more oxygen. Metabolic-wise, we seem to tend to find improvements in muscle glycogen storage, and hormonal, a lot of the stress hormones decrease. And certainly, some of the biggest effects of the taper are seen with strength and muscular power. And your immune system starts to rebound as well, because all that training stress you've thrown at it. That's ideally what you have, isn't it? You have a bit of respite and you come back stronger. So a whole heap of reasons to support the taper. Louise might know the literature on psychological benefits of tapering better than me, but certainly I would say it's the psychological effects that we're probably more aware of in a taper than the physiology. Sometimes with physiology there's a little bit of fear that what you're feeling is a loss of fitness, and you think, oh, maybe I should go back out on my bike. But psychologically you start to feel a bit refreshed. So, and the big thing here I think is the improved quality of sleep, just as you're bringing the training stress off. Okay, I mentioned earlier on that there are different modes of tapering, and this is what I'm referring to. When people have been researching the taper, what they've looked at is actually how to taper the athletes. So the first one, the linear type, would be just reducing the training load in a straight line. So what you're doing here, there's your training, and you just reduce the training load by intensity, frequency, duration in a straight line before race load. So that's one way that we can do that. The step taper is you go from your training load and you just go bam and whack it straight down. And you might actually with step tapers have a series of steps where you train at the same level for a few days and then bring people down again. The exponential one, this is just that green curved slope, and then also the grey curved line as well. And we tend to use those maybe over slightly longer tapers. Can be a little bit complicated. But what's best for you? Like I always come back and say, there's no simple answer. It depends. Ask a scientist a question and they're worse than politicians. But it's very, very individual. And hand on heart, it takes trial and error. Because you are also individual. And yes, I can give you a taper that's based on science and all the research, but ultimately, you're going to have to help me as well in that process. Telling me what feels good and what you feel's worked. And certainly, the shape of the taper is something you can experiment with. How do we change the training stress and the length of the taper, all the variables that we can change. This is what's currently out there. I mentioned earlier about training stress is a combination of volume, intensity, frequency. Those are the variables that we manipulate. So in a training cycle, we bump those up over 3 weeks, then give you a little bit of a rest for the 4th week, and then bump you up again. With the taper, what we tend to do is to keep the intensity and the frequency of the training very similar. The key variable that we change is the training volume. So most of the research, which has been done in swimmers and in running primarily, less out there on cycling, which is a bit of a pain, but most papers tend to suggest about 40 to 60% reduction in your volume is the ideal. The nature of that, whether it's a linear or a slope or a step, is probably less important, but could change depending on the length of the taper.